My name is Victoria Hayes. I'm 44 years old and I've spent the last 23 years serving this country in ways most people will never fully understand. I've crawled through desert sand with bullets whistling overhead. I've carried wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire, and I've made decisions in split seconds that meant the difference between life and death for entire units. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the moment I sat in that Cumberland County courtroom and watched my own brother Marcus stand before a judge and declare with complete conviction that I was a fraud who had never served a day in the military. The silence that followed his words was deafening. I could feel every eye in that packed courtroom burning into me, could sense the collective intake of breath from the gallery where reporters had gathered like vultures. My mother Patricia sat rigid in the front row behind Marcus, her face a mask of cold determination that I barely recognized. My younger brother Tyler hunched in the corner, his eyes fixed on the floor as if he could disappear into the polished wood beneath his feet. But I didn't break. I didn't cry or shout or leap to my feet in outrage. Instead, I reached into my briefcase with steady hands and withdrew the sealed envelope I had been carrying for 3 long months. The envelope that contained everything they thought they knew about me, and everything they never imagined I could prove. As I stood and walked toward the judge's bench, my footsteps echoing in the sudden stillness, I knew that this moment would change everything. Not just for me, but for all of them. Judge Harrison took the envelope with curious eyes, and as he broke the seal and began to read, his expression shifted from mild interest to something much darker. Something that made him look up at me with new understanding, then slowly turn his gaze toward Marcus with what I can only describe as barely controlled fury. What happened next would expose lies that had been festering in my family for years, would tear apart relationships I thought were unbreakable, and would reveal the true cost of greed when it poisons the bonds of blood. But it would also prove something I had always known deep in my heart, that sometimes the truth is worth fighting for, no matter how much it hurts, and that honor isn't just something you earn on a battlefield. Sometimes you have to fight for it in your own home. I wasn't born into wealth, but I was born into something rarer in this world. I was born into a family with roots so deep in the rocky soil of coastal Maine that our name was carved into gravestones dating back to the 1800s. The Hayes family had been lighthouse keepers, ship captains and maritime merchants for 5 generations, and our ancestral home sat perched on the edge of Penobscot Bay like a sentinel watching over the dark Atlantic waters. My father Robert Hayes was the kind of man who believed that character was built through adversity, and that the sea taught you lessons no classroom ever could. He would take me and my brothers out on his fishing boat before dawn, teaching us to read the sky for weather changes, and to respect the power of the ocean that had both sustained and claimed members of our family for over a century. Marcus, being the eldest at 3 years my senior, always seemed to absorb these lessons with the confident assumption that he was destined to inherit not just Dad's knowledge, but his position as head of the family. Tyler, 2 years younger than me, was different from both Marcus and myself. Where Marcus was bold and commanding, and I was curious and restless, Tyler was gentle and observant. He had an artist's soul trapped in a family of mariners, preferring to sketch the seabirds that nested on our cliffs rather than learn the intricacies of nautical navigation. Dad loved him just as fiercely as he loved Marcus and me, but I could see the worry in his eyes sometimes when he watched Tyler struggle with the physical demands of boat work or flinch at the harsh language of the dock workers. Our mother Patricia came from old money, the daughter of a Portland banking family who had initially been horrified when she fell in love with a working-class lighthouse keeper's son. But Dad had built Hayes Maritime Holdings from nothing, transforming a single fishing boat into a successful shipping and logistics company that moved cargo up and down the eastern seaboard. By the time I was born, we lived comfortably in the renovated lighthouse keeper's house that had been in our family since 1847, with modern amenities grafted onto bones of weathered wood and native stone. The house itself was magical in the way that only childhood homes can be. 3 stories of history and memory, with a widow's walk that looked out over miles of open ocean and a basement that still held the massive gears and lenses from the original lighthouse mechanism. My bedroom was in the tower room, where I would fall asleep to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below, and wake to the cry of seagulls and the distant horn of fishing boats heading out for their morning hauls. Marcus thrived in this environment. He seemed born to command, whether he was organizing elaborate games of capture the flag on the beach with neighborhood kids, or helping Dad coordinate shipments from the company's small office above the harbor. Everyone expected him to take over Hayes Maritime Holdings eventually, and Marcus wore that expectation like a comfortable jacket. He was popular in school, captain of the sailing team, and possessed the kind of natural charisma that made people want to follow him. I, on the other hand, was always reaching for something beyond the horizon. I loved our family's history and respected the sea that had shaped us, but I felt called to something larger than the shipping business. I devoured books about explorers and adventurers, about people who had pushed beyond the boundaries of their known world to discover what lay beyond. When I was 16 and announced that I wanted to join the military after high school, the reaction around our dinner table was swift and divided. Marcus laughed outright, not with cruelty but with the dismissive amusement of someone who couldn't imagine why anyone would choose uncertainty over security. "Why would you want to leave all this behind, Vic? You've got a guaranteed future right here with the family business." Dad set down his fork and studied me with those weathered blue eyes that seemed to see everything. "What branch?" he asked quietly. "Army," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Special operations, if I can make it through the training." Mom's reaction was immediate and visceral. "Victoria Hayes, you will not throw your life away chasing some ridiculous fantasy about playing soldier. You have responsibilities to this family, to the business your father has built." But Dad surprised everyone. He nodded slowly and said, "The military made men out of my grandfather and great-grandfather. Maybe it's time the Hayes family had a soldier again." The argument that followed lasted for weeks, with Mom alternately pleading and demanding that I reconsider, Marcus treating my decision as a temporary phase I would outgrow, and Tyler saying little but watching everything with those thoughtful eyes of his. Dad remained my quiet supporter, sharing stories of his own grandfather who had served in World War II and returned home with a chest full of medals and a lifetime of memories he rarely discussed. When I left for basic training at 18, the family was fractured but not broken. Mom cried and refused to come to the bus station to see me off. Marcus shook my hand with bemused affection and told me to call when I was ready to come home and get serious about life. Tyler hugged me fiercely and whispered that he was proud of me, even if he didn't understand why I had to go so far away to find myself. Dad drove me to the station in his old pickup truck, the same one he had used to haul fishing nets and ship parts for 20 years. As we sat in the parking lot waiting for my bus, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden compass that had belonged to his grandfather. "This brought him home from France in 1944, he said, pressing it into my palm. "It's not much, but it's honest. Always points true north, no matter how lost you might feel." I carried that compass with me through basic training, through advanced infantry training, through the grueling selection process for special operations. It was in my pocket during my first deployment to Iraq, where I learned that the skills Dad had taught me about reading weather and understanding terrain translated surprisingly well to military operations. It was with me during my second deployment to Syria, where I earned my first commendation for leading a successful rescue mission behind enemy lines. For the first 5 years of my military career, I maintained regular contact with my family. I would call every Sunday when possible, sharing edited versions of my experiences that wouldn't worry Mom too much while still giving Dad enough detail to satisfy his curiosity about military life. Marcus had indeed taken over more and more responsibilities at Hayes Maritime Holdings, expanding the business into new markets and proving himself to be as capable a businessman as everyone had predicted. Tyler had surprised everyone by enrolling in art school and showing real talent as a marine painter, his canvases capturing the moody beauty of our Maine coastline with remarkable skill. But something began to shift after my third deployment. Maybe it was the accumulating weight of things I had seen and done, or maybe it was the simple fact that the person I was becoming through military service was fundamentally different from the girl who had left Penobscot Bay 6 years earlier. My phone calls home became less frequent, not out of lack of love but because I found it increasingly difficult to bridge the gap between my two worlds. The final break came after my fourth deployment, the one that changed everything. I can't talk about the specifics even now, not because they're classified, though some details are, but because some memories are too heavy to share casually. What I can say is that on a desert night in a place whose name I've never spoken aloud to anyone in my family, I made a decision that saved 17 lives and very nearly cost me my own. When I woke up in a military hospital in Germany 3 weeks later, missing 2 fingers on my left hand and carrying shrapnel in my shoulder that would never be completely removed. The first face I saw belonged to Colonel Stevens, my commanding officer. He was holding a folder thick with paperwork and wearing an expression I had never seen on his usually stoic features. "Hayes," he said quietly, "I've been in the Army for 28 years, and I've never been prouder to serve alongside anyone. What you did out there isn't a medal big enough, but we're going to try." The Congressional Medal of Honor ceremony took place at the White House on a crisp October morning. I wore my dress uniform with its neat rows of ribbons and tried to focus on the gravity of the moment rather than the way my injured hand shook slightly as the president placed the medal around my neck. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism, of disregarding personal safety to save others, of embodying the highest traditions of military service. My family wasn't there. I had told them about the ceremony, but Mom had claimed it was too far to travel on short notice. Marcus was dealing with a crisis at the company, and Tyler was in the middle of preparing for his first major art exhibition. Dad had wanted to come. I could hear it in his voice when we spoke on the phone, but Mom had convinced him that his presence would seem like favoritism toward my military phase over Marcus's dedication to the family business.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Standing there in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by fellow service members and their families, I felt the final thread, connecting me to my childhood home stretch thin and snap. I was Victoria Hayes, recipient of the nation's highest military honor, but I was also suddenly and completely alone in a way I had never experienced before. After my medical retirement from active duty, I found work as a defense contractor, using my specialized skills to train other special operations units. It was challenging work that kept me busy and allowed me to feel like I was still contributing to something larger than myself, but it also kept me away from Maine for months at a time. My contact with my family dwindled to holiday phone calls and the occasional email sharing updates about my life that always felt inadequate and somehow false. 7 years passed this way, 7 years of building a life that was entirely separate from the lighthouse keeper's house where I had grown up. I bought a small apartment in Virginia, close enough to Washington, D.C. to make my work commute manageable but far enough away to feel like home. I made friends among other veterans, people who understood the particular challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. I even dated occasionally, though nothing ever developed into anything serious. Then on a gray February morning, Tyler called with news that would pull me back into the orbit of my family whether I was ready or not. Dad had suffered a massive heart attack while checking on one of the company's ships in the harbor. He died instantly, Tyler said through tears, probably the way he would have wanted to go if he had been given a choice. He was found slumped over the ship's midfist with his reading glasses still on, as if he had simply decided to take a nap while working. The funeral was the first time I had been back to Penobscot Bay in 4 years. The lighthouse keeper's house looked smaller than I remembered, but somehow more solid, as if it had sunk deeper roots into the rocky soil during my absence. Marcus had arranged everything with his typical efficiency, from the memorial service at the old stone church where 3 generations of Hayes family members had been married and buried, to the reception afterward at the yacht club where Dad had been a member for 30 years. I wore my dress uniform to the funeral, not out of any desire to make a statement but because it felt like the most honest way to honor Dad's memory. The medal wasn't visible beneath my uniform jacket, but I could feel its weight against my chest like a secret I was carrying for him. Marcus wore a perfectly tailored black suit and delivered a eulogy that spoke eloquently about Dad's legacy as a businessman and community leader. Tyler, pale and shaken, read a poem he had written about the sea calling Dad home. Mom sat in the front pew like a marble statue, accepting condolences with gracious composure but avoiding my eyes throughout the entire service. When people approached me afterward, they spoke in the careful, respectful tones that people use when they're not quite sure what to say to someone who has been away for so long. A few of Dad's old friends mentioned that they had heard I was doing something in the military, but the conversations felt stilted and uncomfortable, as if we were all performing roles we weren't quite sure how to play. The reading of the will took place 3 days after the funeral, in the offices of Pemberton and Associates, the law firm that had handled the Hayes family's legal affairs for 40 years. I sat between Tyler and Marcus in comfortable leather chairs, while Harold Pemberton, a dignified man in his 70s who had known Dad since college, explained the distribution of assets with professional precision. Marcus inherited Hayes Maritime Holdings in its entirety, along with the majority of Dad's liquid assets and investment portfolio. Tyler received a substantial trust fund that would support his artistic career for the rest of his life if managed wisely. Mom kept the house in Portland where she and Dad had lived for the past 10 years, along with enough money to maintain her comfortable lifestyle indefinitely. And I inherited the lighthouse keeper's house. The silence that followed this announcement was profound and loaded with meanings I was only beginning to understand. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mom's carefully controlled expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the surface. Tyler looked at me with what might have been relief or apology. I couldn't tell which. "There's also this," Harold continued, producing a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Dad's familiar handwriting. "Robert asked me to give this to you privately, Victoria, but I think given the circumstances, it's appropriate to share it with the family." He opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper covered with Dad's careful script. His voice was steady as he read, but I could see the emotion in his eyes. "Victoria, I'm writing this because I know you won't understand why I'm leaving you the house instead of giving it to Marcus with the business. The truth is you're the only one who truly inherited the Hayes spirit, the part of us that isn't afraid to sail into unknown waters. Marcus is a fine businessman, and Tyler is a gifted artist, but you're the keeper of who we really are. The house has been waiting for you to come home. I hope someday you will. Love, Dad." The drive back to the lighthouse keeper's house was silent except for the sound of tires on gravel and the distant crash of waves against the rocks. I had agreed to stay there for a few days to sort through Dad's personal belongings, a task that felt both necessary and overwhelming. Marcus and Tyler helped me carry my bags inside, but they left quickly, as if the house itself made them uncomfortable. That first night alone in my childhood home, I walked through rooms filled with shadows and memories. Dad's reading chair still held the impression of his body. His coffee mug sat in the kitchen sink, unwashed. His jacket hung on the hook by the front door as if he might walk through it at any moment. I climbed the narrow stairs to my old bedroom in the tower, where Dad had left everything exactly as it had been the day I left for basic training. My high school sailing trophies still lined the windowsill. My bookshelf still held the adventure novels and military histories that had first sparked my dreams of service. The compass Dad had given me sat on my old desk, pointing steadily toward magnetic north, just as it had for over 70 years. Standing at the window that had framed so many childhood dreams, looking out over the dark expanse of Penobscot Bay, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about my next assignment or my next move. I was simply present in this place that had shaped me, surrounded by the accumulated weight of family history and personal memory. I didn't know it then, but that moment of peace would be one of the last I would experience for months to come. Because 3 weeks later, I would receive a thick packet of legal documents that would shatter any illusion I had about coming home to heal and reconnect with my family. 3 weeks later, I would discover that greed had been growing like a cancer in the Hayes family tree, and that some of the people I loved most in the world had been planning my destruction from the moment Dad's will was read. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier who looked apologetic as he handed me the thick manila envelope. I was sitting on the front porch of the lighthouse keeper's house, drinking coffee and watching the fishing boats navigate their way back to harbor through the morning fog. The salt air carried the familiar sounds of home, the cry of gulls, the distant rumble of diesel engines, the rhythmic clang of buoy bells marking the channel. I signed for the envelope without much thought, assuming it was probably something routine related to Dad's estate, or perhaps insurance paperwork that needed my attention. It wasn't until I broke the wax seal and began reading the first page that I realized my world was about to implode in ways I had never imagined possible. The letterhead belonged to Morrison, Keller and Associates, a high-powered law firm from Portland that specialized in complex litigation. The language was formal and coldly professional, but the meaning was unmistakable. Marcus and my mother Patricia were filing suit to contest Dad's will, claiming that I had exercised undue influence over him during his final years to secure the lighthouse property for myself. They alleged that my military service was largely fabricated, that I had manipulated Dad's emotions by exaggerating my accomplishments and injuries, and that the will should be nullified based on my fraudulent misrepresentation of my character and service record. I read the document 3 times before the full scope of their accusations sank in. They weren't just challenging my inheritance, they were systematically attacking everything I was, everything I had done, everything I had sacrificed in service to my country. According to the lawsuit, I was a pathological liar who had concocted elaborate stories about my military career to gain sympathy and financial advantage. They claimed I had never seen combat, that my injuries were the result of a training accident that I had deliberately misrepresented, and that my medals and commendations were either fabricated or obtained through deception. The cruelest blow was a paragraph near the end of the document that quoted private conversations I had supposedly had with Dad during my rare visits home. According to Marcus and Mom, I had told Dad that I was struggling financially, that I needed the lighthouse property to secure my future, and that my military career had been a disappointment that left me with nothing to show for my years of service. These conversations had never happened. Every word was a lie, but they were lies crafted with enough plausible detail to sound convincing to someone who didn't know me well. I set the papers down on the weathered porch table and stared out at the bay, trying to process what I was reading. The fishing boats had disappeared into the harbor, leaving behind only the endless expanse of gray water, and the distant line where sea met sky. For a moment I felt utterly alone in a way that had nothing to do with physical isolation. This was the loneliness of betrayal, the hollow ache that comes when people you love reveal themselves to be strangers capable of cruelties you never imagined. My phone rang while I was still sitting there in stunned silence. Tyler's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I hoped he was calling to explain, to tell me this was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. But when I answered, his voice was tight with tension and something that might have been fear. "Vic, I just heard about the lawsuit. I wanted you to hear this from me before you found out some other way. I'm not part of it. I didn't know they were planning this until this morning."
"But you're not opposing it either," I said quietly. The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to hear the sound of Tyler's breathing, the faint background noise of what sounded like his art studio. "I don't know what to do," he finally admitted. "Marcus says he has evidence that proves Dad wasn't thinking clearly when he changed his will. Mom says you've been lying to us for years about what really happened in the military. I don't know what to believe anymore." "You could believe me," I suggested, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "You could believe your sister who has never lied to you about anything that mattered." "I want to," Tyler said, and I could hear the genuine anguish in his words. "But Marcus showed me things, Vic, documents and records that don't match what you've told us about your service. And the timing of Dad changing his will, right after your last visit home, it looks suspicious." I closed my eyes and tried to remember my last conversation with Dad, the phone call we'd had just 2 weeks before his heart attack. We had talked about the weather, about how Tyler's art career was progressing, about a new shipping contract Marcus had landed for the company. Dad had sounded tired but content, proud of all his children in his own quiet way. There had been nothing about inheritance or financial struggles or any of the desperate manipulations Marcus and Mom were now claiming. "Tyler," I said carefully, "what kind of documents did Marcus show you?" Another pause, this one shorter but somehow more loaded with meaning. "Service records that show you were injured in a training accident, not in combat. Medical reports that contradict what you told us about your injuries. And there's no record of you receiving any of the medals you said you earned." My hand tightened on the phone as the full scope of their deception became clear. Marcus hadn't just decided to contest the will on a whim. He had been planning this for months, possibly years, building a case based on carefully constructed lies and forged documents. The level of preparation and malicious intent was staggering, but what hurt most was the realization that Tyler, sweet, gentle Tyler, who had always been my closest ally in the family, was being manipulated into doubting me. "Those documents are fake, Tyler. Everything Marcus showed you is fabricated. My real service records are classified at levels he could never access, and my medals are locked in a safe deposit box in Virginia. But more than that, you know me. You've known me your entire life. Do you really think I'm capable of the kind of elaborate deception they're describing?" "I don't know what I think anymore," Tyler said, his voice breaking slightly. "I love you, Vic, but I also love Mom and Marcus. This is tearing the family apart, and I don't know how to fix it." After Tyler hung up, I sat on the porch for another hour, watching the fog roll in from the Atlantic and thinking about the chess game Marcus had been playing while I was distracted by grief and nostalgia. He had used the months since Dad's death to build his case systematically, gathering allies and fabricating evidence while I was sorting through memories and trying to heal old wounds. The next morning, I drove to Portland to meet with Harold Pemberton, Dad's longtime attorney. His offices occupied the top floor of a granite building that had weathered a century of Maine winters, and Harold himself seemed carved from the same enduring stone. He listened to my concerns with the patient attention of someone who had seen every possible variation of family dysfunction during his 40 years of practice. "I'm not surprised this is happening," he said, when I finished explaining the situation. "Marcus approached me 6 months ago about potentially challenging any changes to your father's will. I refused to represent him, of course, due to conflict of interest, but I could see he was determined to pursue the matter." 6 months ago, I repeated, the timeline making my stomach clench. "Dad was still alive 6 months ago." Harold nodded grimly. "Marcus seemed to believe your father was becoming unduly influenced by your military service, that Robert was planning to make changes to his estate plan that would unfairly benefit you. When I told Marcus that his father was entirely competent to make his own decisions about his property, Marcus became quite agitated. He suggested that you had been feeding Robert false information about your military career to gain sympathy." The office felt suddenly airless despite the cool March weather outside. Marcus had been planning to destroy me before Dad was even dead, had been laying the groundwork for this character assassination while I was living my life completely unaware of his intentions. The betrayal was so complete, so coldly calculated, that I found myself struggling to reconcile this version of my brother with the person I thought I had known. "What are my options?" I asked. Harold pulled out a thick file folder and spread several documents across his mahogany desk. "Legally, you're in a strong position. Your father's will was properly executed. He was demonstrably competent when he signed it, and there were witnesses to his intentions. But Marcus and your mother are attacking your character rather than the legal validity of the will itself. They're claiming that you defrauded Robert by misrepresenting your military service, which would invalidate any gifts made based on that false information. So I need to prove my military record is legitimate. That's part of it, yes. But there's a complication. Much of your actual service record appears to be classified at very high levels. The documents I can access through normal legal channels are heavily redacted and don't provide the kind of detailed information that would definitively refute Marcus's claims. I thought about the medal locked away in my safe deposit box, about the citation that detailed actions I had never fully described to anyone in my family. The Congressional Medal of Honor wasn't something that could be fabricated or falsely claimed, but explaining how I had earned it would require revealing classified details about operations that were still sensitive years later. "There's something else," Harold continued, his expression growing more troubled. "Marcus has hired a very expensive investigative firm to look into your background. They've been interviewing people who knew you during your service, trying to find contradictions or inconsistencies in your story. And they've been remarkably successful at convincing people to cooperate." "What do you mean?" "They've found former colleagues willing to testify that you exaggerated your role in certain operations, that you took credit for achievements that belonged to others, that your injuries were less severe than you claimed. These people may be lying or mistaken, but they're providing sworn statements that support Marcus's version of events." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Maine weather. Marcus wasn't just attacking me, he was systematically destroying the relationships and reputations I had built over 2 decades of military service. He was turning my own comrades against me, convincing them to betray confidences and misrepresent events, for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. "How is he getting people to lie for him?" Harold's expression was grim. "Money mostly. The investigative firm is offering substantial payments for information, and some people are more susceptible to financial incentives than others. There may also be threats involved, though nothing we can prove." I left Harold's office feeling like I was fighting a war on multiple fronts against an enemy who had been preparing for battle while I was still trying to make peace. Marcus had resources, motivation, and a willingness to destroy anything that stood between him and what he wanted. He had also underestimated one crucial factor: I hadn't survived combat zones and classified operations by giving up when the odds seemed impossible. The first counterattack came from an unexpected direction. I was eating dinner alone in the lighthouse keeper's house when my phone rang with a call from Colonel Stevens, my former commanding officer. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year, and hearing his gruff voice brought back memories of briefing rooms and mission planning sessions that seemed like they belonged to another lifetime.
Hayes, I've been getting some interesting phone calls lately. Investigators asking questions about your service record, wanting to know if you were really the hero the Army made you out to be. I told them they could go to hell, but I thought you should know what's happening. I explained the situation as briefly as possible, focusing on the legal challenge rather than the family dynamics that had led to it. Colonel Stevens listened without interruption, and when I finished, his response was immediate and forceful. This is complete horseshit, Hayes. I've seen your classified service jacket, and anyone who says you didn't earn every medal and commendation you received is either lying or ignorant. The problem is, most of what you did is still classified above the level these civilian investigators can access. I know. My attorney says we need documentation to refute their claims, but everything that would prove my case is locked away in classified files. Maybe not everything, Colonel Stevens said thoughtfully. Give me a few days to make some calls. There might be ways to declassify certain information for legal proceedings, especially when it involves false accusations against a Medal of Honor recipient. Hope flickered in my chest for the first time since receiving the lawsuit papers. You think that's possible? I think you saved 17 lives in circumstances that would have broken most people, and I'm not going to let some civilian lawyers destroy your reputation based on lies and forged documents. The Army takes care of its own, Hayes. We're not going to abandon you now. While Colonel Stevens worked his contacts in Washington, I began my own investigation into Marcus's activities. It quickly became clear that his assault on my character was more sophisticated and far-reaching than I had initially realized. He had been building his case for months, using private investigators and substantial financial resources to create a narrative that painted me as a desperate fraud, willing to exploit Dad's love and patriotism for personal gain. The investigators had interviewed dozens of people from my past, from high school classmates to former military colleagues, always asking leading questions designed to elicit information that could be twisted to support their preferred narrative. They had offered money for negative information about me, promised anonymity to people willing to make damaging statements, and in some cases had apparently misrepresented themselves and their motives to gain cooperation. Most disturbing was the discovery that they had somehow gained access to medical records from my treatment after my final deployment. These records, which should have been protected by privacy laws, had been altered to make my injuries appear less severe, and to suggest that they had occurred during routine training rather than combat operations. The forgeries were sophisticated enough to fool casual inspection, but they contained subtle errors that revealed their fraudulent nature to anyone with detailed knowledge of military medical procedures. I was beginning to understand that Marcus wasn't just trying to win a legal case. He was trying to destroy me so completely that I would have no choice but to disappear from the family entirely, leaving him free to control Hayes Maritime Holdings and the family legacy, without any interference from the sister who had always represented a different set of values and priorities. The media attention began in the fourth week after the lawsuit was filed. Someone, probably Marcus's public relations team, had leaked selected details of the case to reporters who specialized in military fraud stories. The initial coverage was relatively restrained, focusing on the legal dispute over Dad's will without making explicit accusations about my service record. But the implication was clear. Here was another case of stolen valor, another fraud attempting to profit from false claims about military heroism. I stopped going into town after the third time I was approached by reporters wanting my comment on the allegations. The lighthouse keeper's house became both sanctuary and prison, a place where I could think and plan without being constantly reminded of how quickly public opinion could turn against someone based on carefully crafted lies and strategic media manipulation. Tyler visited once during this period, showing up at my door on a rainy Thursday evening looking haggard and conflicted. We sat in Dad's old living room, surrounded by maritime artifacts and family photographs that seemed to mock the current state of our relationships, and tried to have a conversation that felt increasingly impossible with each passing minute. I don't want to be in the middle of this, Tyler said, his artist's hands twisting together in his lap. I love all of you, and watching this family tear itself apart is killing me. Then don't be in the middle, I replied. Believe what you know to be true about me, and stop letting Marcus manipulate you with forged documents and manufactured evidence. But what if he's right? Tyler asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if Dad wasn't thinking clearly when he changed his will? What if you did exaggerate things to make him feel sorry for you? I looked at my youngest brother, this gentle soul who had always been the peacemaker in our family, and realized that Marcus's poison had spread further than I had feared.
Tyler wasn't just doubting my military record, he was doubting everything he thought he knew about me as a person. Do you remember when you were 8 years old and Jimmy Morrison was bullying you at school? I asked. Tyler nodded hesitantly. Do you remember how I dealt with Jimmy Morrison? A small smile crossed Tyler's face despite his obvious distress. You didn't fight him. You talked to his parents and found out his father was deployed overseas and his mother was working 2 jobs to make ends meet. You organized a fundraiser at school to help his family, and Jimmy stopped being mean to everyone because he realized people cared about him. That's who I am, Tyler. That's who I've always been. I solve problems by understanding them, not by creating bigger problems. Do you really think someone with that kind of character would spend years lying to Dad about military service in order to steal inheritance money? Tyler was quiet for a long time, staring at the rain streaming down the windows and the dark outline of the bay beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice was stronger but still uncertain. Marcus showed me bank records that prove you've been struggling financially. He says that's proof you had motive to manipulate Dad. I live modestly because I choose to live modestly, I said. I don't need expensive cars or designer clothes to feel good about myself. The fact that I don't spend money on luxuries doesn't mean I'm desperate or dishonest. But the medical records are forgeries, Tyler, sophisticated ones but forgeries nonetheless. When this goes to trial, experts will be able to prove they've been altered. Tyler left that night without committing to either side of the family conflict, but I could see that seeds of doubt about Marcus's narrative had been planted. It wasn't enough to guarantee his support, but it was a beginning. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later, when Colonel Stevens called with news that would change everything about the legal battle Marcus thought he was fighting. I've got authorization to declassify portions of your service record for use in legal proceedings, he said without preamble. Not everything, but enough to prove beyond any shadow of doubt that you are exactly who you say you are. There's also going to be some additional documentation that your brother and his lawyers aren't expecting. What kind of additional documentation? The kind that proves Medal of Honor recipients don't get their awards by filing false paperwork or exaggerating training accidents. When this information becomes part of the court record, the people who have been helping your brother destroy your reputation are going to have some very uncomfortable questions to answer. I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't experienced since this whole nightmare began, the calm confidence that comes from knowing you're fighting from a position of unassailable truth. Marcus had built his case on lies and forgeries, betting that my actual service record would remain hidden behind classification barriers. He was about to discover that some truths are too important to remain buried, and that the United States Army doesn't abandon its heroes just because civilians don't understand the value of honor. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose years of family deception and reveal the true cost of choosing greed over loyalty. But first I had to survive the storm that was about to break over all of us with a fury that would make the worst Atlantic hurricane seem like a gentle spring rain. The transformation began on a foggy April morning, when Tyler appeared at my kitchen door carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing an expression I hadn't seen since we were children. There was something resolute in his posture, a quiet determination that reminded me of Dad, when he had made a decision that couldn't be unmade. He sat down at the scarred wooden table, where we had eaten countless childhood breakfasts, and placed a small digital recorder between us. I need you to listen to something, he said without preamble, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the play button. Marcus's voice filled the kitchen, crystal clear and chillingly casual as he spoke to someone on what was obviously a phone call. The beauty of this whole thing is that Victoria has been out of touch for so long, nobody really knows what she did or didn't do in the military. We just need to create enough doubt to make the judge question Dad's judgment when he rewrote that will. A woman's voice responded, and I realized with a sick jolt that it was Mom. Are you sure this will work? What if she has proof of her service record? Most of her real records are classified, Marcus replied with smug confidence.
The documents I've had prepared are good enough to fool any civilian court, and I've got 3 former soldiers willing to testify that she exaggerated her role in various operations. By the time we're done, she'll look like a pathological liar who spent years manipulating Dad's emotions for financial gain. And Tyler? Mom asked. Tyler will fall in line once he sees the evidence. He's always been weak, and he won't want to be associated with Victoria once her reputation is destroyed. The whole family will be better off without her influence. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, revealing the depth and sophistication of their conspiracy. They had spent months planning not just the legal challenge, but a comprehensive campaign to destroy my reputation and isolate me from anyone who might support me. They had bribed former colleagues, forged medical records, and even arranged for positive character witnesses to be discredited through manufactured scandals. When Tyler finally turned off the recorder, the silence in the kitchen felt profound and heavy. I stared at him across the table, this gentle soul who had been caught in the crossfire of a war he never wanted to fight, and saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not just anger, but a kind of moral clarity that transforms decent people into forces of nature when they finally understand what they're really fighting for. I recorded this 3 nights ago when Marcus thought I had gone home, Tyler said quietly. He was in Dad's old office at the company, talking to Mom on speakerphone while he reviewed strategy documents with his lawyers. I'd gone back to get some of Dad's personal items, and I heard voices coming from the office. "How long have you suspected?" Tyler's laugh was bitter and self-recriminating. "I should have suspected from the beginning. Marcus has always been calculating, but this level of cruelty, I kept telling myself there had to be some truth to his accusations, that you must have done something to justify this kind of response. But then I started paying attention to the details." He pulled out a manila folder and spread several documents across the table. "These are the medical records Marcus showed me, the ones that supposedly prove your injuries were from a training accident rather than combat. I'm not a doctor, but I paint human figures, so I understand anatomy. The injury patterns described in these reports don't match the scars I've seen on your shoulder and arm." I looked down at the forged medical documents, noting the subtle inconsistencies that Tyler's artist's eye had spotted. The positioning of the shrapnel wounds was wrong, the healing patterns didn't match the timeline, and the surgical notes described procedures that would have left different scars than the ones I actually carried. "There's more," Tyler continued, pulling out additional papers. "I did some research on the investigative firm Marcus hired. They specialize in manufacturing evidence for wealthy clients involved in inheritance disputes. 3 of their previous cases involved falsified military records, and 2 of those cases resulted in criminal charges against the firm's employees. The scope of Marcus's deception was staggering, but what struck me most was the realization that Tyler had been conducting his own investigation while pretending to remain neutral. He had been gathering evidence of the conspiracy while allowing Marcus and Mom to believe they had successfully manipulated him into doubt. "Why didn't you tell me you suspected?" I asked. "Because I needed to be sure," Tyler replied. "And because I knew that once I chose a side, there would be no going back. Marcus and Mom will never forgive me for this, Vic. When they find out I've been working against them, I'll be dead to them just like they wanted you to be." I reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of holding paintbrushes and palette knives. "Are you sure you want to do this? Once we use that recording, your relationship with them is over forever." Tyler's smile was sad but determined. "My relationship with them ended the moment they decided to destroy my sister based on lies. I just didn't realize it until now." Over the next week, Tyler and I worked together to build a comprehensive picture of Marcus's conspiracy. He had kept copies of everything: the forged documents, the communications with the investigative firm, the financial records showing payments to false witnesses, even photographs of meetings between Marcus's lawyers and people who had agreed to provide damaging testimony about my military service. The evidence painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond a simple inheritance dispute. Marcus had created an entire alternate reality designed to justify stealing property that rightfully belonged to me, and he had been willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The 3 former soldiers who had agreed to testify against me had been approached with a combination of financial incentives and veiled threats about their own military records being scrutinized if they didn't cooperate. Most damaging of all was a series of emails between Marcus and the head of the investigative firm, discussing strategies for neutralizing my military contacts who might be able to verify my actual service record. They had identified Colonel Stevens as a particular threat and had developed plans to discredit him through manufactured allegations about his own conduct during our shared deployments. "This isn't just fraud," I told Tyler as we reviewed the evidence. "This is conspiracy, witness tampering, and potentially treason. They're attacking the integrity of military service records and threatening active duty personnel to cover up their crimes." Tyler nodded grimly. "Marcus has always believed that money and connections could solve any problem. I don't think he realizes that some institutions can't be bought or intimidated. The decision to bring our evidence to the authorities rather than simply using it in the civil case was difficult but necessary. Marcus had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, had committed crimes that endangered not just my reputation but the integrity of military service records for all veterans. Colonel Stevens put us in touch with military investigators who specialized in fraud cases involving service members, and within days we had a team of federal agents working to unravel the full extent of the conspiracy. The investigation moved with the swift efficiency that characterizes military operations when the stakes are clear and the mission is righteous. The forged medical records were quickly identified as fraudulent by experts who could spot the digital manipulation that had created them. The three former soldiers who had agreed to provide false testimony broke down under questioning and admitted they had been coerced into lying about operations they had never been involved in. Most significantly, the military investigators discovered that Marcus's conspiracy had inadvertently exposed classified information about my actual service record. In their eagerness to create convincing forgeries, his team had referenced details about deployments and operations that were still classified, information they could only have obtained through illegal channels. The implications were staggering. Marcus hadn't just committed fraud, he had potentially compromised national security by accessing classified military information for use in a civilian legal case. The investigation expanded to include counterintelligence agencies, and suddenly my family's inheritance dispute had become a matter of federal law enforcement priority. Through all of this, Tyler remained my constant ally and supporter, even as the weight of what we had uncovered threatened to crush both of us. He had sacrificed his relationship with Marcus and Mom to stand for truth, and I could see the cost of that choice in the new lines around his eyes, and the way his hands shook when he thought about what lay ahead. "Do you regret it?" I asked him one evening as we sat on the lighthouse keeper's porch, watching the sun set over Penobscot Bay. "I regret that it was necessary," Tyler replied. "I regret that our brother turned into someone I don't recognize, and I regret that Mom chose money over family. But I don't regret standing with you. Dad would have expected me to do the right thing, even when it was hard." The breakthrough that would ultimately expose the full scope of Marcus's crimes came from an unexpected source. One of the federal investigators had been tracking the financial flows involved in bribing false witnesses, and had discovered that Marcus had been using Hayes Maritime Holdings Company funds to pay for his conspiracy. What had started as a personal vendetta had evolved into corporate fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of business assets for illegal purposes. The discovery triggered an immediate audit of the company's financial records, revealing years of questionable transactions and creative accounting that had nothing to do with the lawsuit against me. Marcus had been treating Hayes Maritime Holdings as his personal piggy bank, using company resources to fund his lifestyle, his legal battles, and his various schemes to consolidate power within the family. Even more damaging was the revelation that some of the company's shipping contracts had been obtained through bribes and kickbacks, creating potential criminal liability that extended far beyond the inheritance dispute. Marcus had built his business success on a foundation of corruption that was now crumbling under federal scrutiny. "He's going to prison," Tyler said quietly when we learned about the expanded investigation. "Even if he somehow beats the military fraud charges, the financial crimes alone will put him away for years." I felt a complex mix of emotions as the reality of Marcus's situation sank in. There was satisfaction in knowing that justice would be served, but also profound sadness at the waste of it all. Marcus had possessed genuine business talent, and could have built a legitimate empire if he had been willing to work within ethical boundaries. Instead, he had chosen shortcuts and corruption, and now he would lose everything he had thought he was protecting. Mom's role in the conspiracy was more limited, but equally damaging to her future relationships within the family. She had knowingly participated in the fraud, had provided information used to create forged documents, and had actively worked to isolate me from Tyler and other potential supporters. While her legal exposure was less severe than Marcus's, the moral judgment was equally harsh. The irony wasn't lost on me that Mom had always worried about my military service taking me away from the family, when it was her own choices that would ultimately destroy her relationship with both of her surviving children. Tyler and I would never be able to trust her again, and the Hayes family legacy she had been so eager to protect would be forever tainted by scandal and criminality. As federal agents executed search warrants at Hayes Maritime Holdings and Marcus's personal residences, I found myself thinking about Dad and wondering what he would have made of the chaos that had followed his death. He had believed in honor, integrity, and the importance of family loyalty, but he had also understood that loyalty couldn't be built on lies or maintained through fear. The lighthouse keeper's house felt like a sanctuary during those turbulent weeks, a place where Tyler and I could process the magnitude of what we had uncovered while staying connected to the values that had shaped us as children. We spent hours talking about Dad's legacy and what it meant to be a Hayes in a world where our family name had become associated with fraud and betrayal. "We have to rebuild," Tyler said during one of those conversations. "Not the business, that's probably finished, but the family. We have to show people that Marcus doesn't represent who we really are." I agreed, but I also knew that rebuilding would be a long and difficult process. The media attention surrounding the federal investigation had made the Hayes name synonymous with scandal, and overcoming that reputation would require years of consistent ethical behavior and community service. The personal cost of the investigation was enormous for both Tyler and me. He had lost his mother and brother, while I had lost any illusion that family bonds were strong enough to overcome greed and ambition. We had each other, and we had the truth, but some kinds of damage couldn't be repaired simply by winning a legal battle. The declassified portions of my military service record arrived through official channels, just as the federal investigation was reaching its crescendo. Colonel Stevens had worked tirelessly to get authorization for the release, and the documents that emerged painted a picture of service that was far more distinguished and heroic than even I had described to my family. The citation for my Congressional Medal of Honor detailed actions that had saved not just 17 lives, as I had told Tyler, but an entire forward operating base that had been under sustained enemy attack. The classified mission reports showed a pattern of exceptional leadership and personal courage that had earned me the respect of commanding officers and fellow soldiers alike. Reading through those documents with Tyler, seeing my military career laid out in official language that captured both the danger and the honor of what I had done, I felt a deep sense of vindication that had nothing to do with legal victories or family disputes. These records proved that I was exactly who I had always claimed to be, and no amount of forged documents or false testimony could change that fundamental truth. "I'm proud of you," Tyler said quietly as he finished reading the last of the declassified reports. "I've always been proud of you, but now I understand why Dad was so determined to leave you the lighthouse. You're the keeper of the family honor, the one who remembers what we're supposed to stand for." The federal investigation was nearing its conclusion, with criminal charges imminent against Marcus and several of his co-conspirators. The civil lawsuit challenging Dad's will had been quietly dropped by Marcus's attorneys, who were now focused on keeping their client out of federal prison. The lighthouse keeper's house was officially and permanently mine, but the victory felt hollow given the cost in family relationships and personal pain. As spring turned toward summer, Tyler and I began planning for a future that neither of us had imagined 6 months earlier. He would continue his art career, but with a new focus on themes of integrity and moral courage that had been tested by our family's crisis. I would remain in the lighthouse keeper's house, at least for now, and consider what role I wanted to play in rebuilding the Hayes family reputation. The formal confrontation that would end this phase of our family's story was still ahead of us, scheduled for a courtroom, where Marcus would finally face the consequences of his choices. But the real battle had already been won in the quiet moments when Tyler chose truth over comfort, when federal investigators chose justice over expedience, and when I chose to fight for my reputation rather than simply disappearing to avoid conflict. The lighthouse that had guided ships safely to harbor for over a century would continue its vigilant watch over Penobscot Bay, and the Hayes family would endure, scarred but not broken, tested but not destroyed. Some truths are worth fighting for, no matter what they cost, and some honors can never be stolen by those who lack the courage to earn them honestly. The Cumberland County Superior Court had never seen anything quite like the circus that descended upon it on the morning of June 15th. Federal marshals flanked the courthouse steps while news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray Maine sky like mechanical flowers, seeking signal instead of sunlight. I walked through the media gauntlet, wearing my dress uniform, the weight of my medals a familiar comfort against my chest, while cameras clicked and reporters shouted questions I had no intention of answering. Tyler walked beside me, his artist's eye taking in every detail of the scene, with the quiet intensity I remembered from our childhood. He had chosen to wear one of Dad's old suits, navy blue wool, that still carried the faint scent of salt air and pipe tobacco. It was a deliberate choice, a way of honoring our father's memory, while standing witness to the destruction of everything Marcus had built on lies and corruption. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric with tension and barely contained anticipation. This wasn't just a civil hearing about an inheritance dispute anymore.
Marcus faced federal criminal charges that could send him to prison for decades, while the civil case had become a mere formality now that the truth about his conspiracy had been exposed. But I needed this moment, needed to see justice served in the same courtroom where he had tried to destroy my reputation and steal my inheritance. Harold Pemberton sat at the plaintiff's table, his weathered face grave, as he reviewed documents that would finally tell the complete story of Marcus's fraud. Across the aisle, Marcus's legal team looked like they were preparing for a funeral rather than a court hearing. Their client's position had become indefensible once the federal investigation uncovered the full scope of his crimes, but they were still required to go through the motions of representing him. Marcus himself sat rigid in his chair, wearing an expensive suit that couldn't hide the hollow look in his eyes, or the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. The confident businessman who had orchestrated this conspiracy had been replaced by a broken man facing the collapse of everything he had built. Mom sat behind him, her face a mask of brittle composure that fooled no one who knew her well. The transformation in both of them was startling and somehow tragic. These were people I had loved, had grown up with, had shared countless family memories with over the years. Now they sat across the courtroom like strangers, like opponents whose hatred had consumed whatever familial affection might once have existed between us. Judge Harrison entered with the measured dignity that marked him as a jurist who understood the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about money or property anymore, it was about justice, integrity, and the price of choosing personal gain over family loyalty. He took his seat and surveyed the packed courtroom with eyes that had seen every variety of human folly during his 30 years on the bench. Before we proceed with the formal hearing, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying easily through the silent courtroom. I want to acknowledge that this case has evolved far beyond its original parameters. What began as a civil dispute over estate planning has revealed criminal conspiracy, fraud, and attempts to undermine the integrity of military service records. The court has been fully briefed on the federal investigation and its findings. He paused to look directly at Marcus, his expression stern but not unkind. Mr. Hayes, your attorneys have informed the court that you wish to make a statement before we proceed. Is that correct? Marcus rose slowly, his legs visibly unsteady as he stood before the judge who would decide his immediate future. For a moment he seemed to struggle with the words, his mouth opening and closing without sound. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Your Honor, I want to withdraw all claims against my sister's inheritance. The lighthouse property rightfully belongs to Victoria Hayes, as specified in our father's will. I also want to formally apologize to this court and to my sister for the lies and fabricated evidence I presented in my original filing. The admission sent a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom gallery, but Marcus wasn't finished. He turned to look at me directly for the first time since the hearing began, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been genuine remorse, though it was difficult to distinguish from the desperation of a man facing federal prison time. Victoria, I know you have no reason to forgive me, and I'm not asking you to. What I did was unforgivable. I let greed and jealousy poison my judgment, and I tried to destroy the reputation you earned through genuine sacrifice and service to our country. I dishonored Dad's memory, I betrayed our family, and I committed crimes that have shamed the Hayes name forever. The silence that followed Marcus's statement was profound and heavy. I felt Tyler's hand briefly touch my shoulder, a gesture of support and solidarity that reminded me I wasn't alone in this moment of reckoning. Around us the courtroom waited to see how I would respond to this public admission of guilt and request for forgiveness. I stood slowly, not because the court required it, but because this moment demanded the full weight of my presence and attention. When I spoke, my voice was steady and clear, carrying the authority I had learned during years of military command. Marcus, I accept your admission of guilt and your withdrawal of all claims against my inheritance. But I want everyone in this courtroom to understand something. You didn't just attack me personally. You attacked the integrity of military service records, you threatened and bribed veterans who served honorably, and you attempted to undermine public confidence in the institutions that protect our national security. I paused to let those words sink in, both for Marcus and for the reporters who were documenting every moment of this confrontation. The damage you've done extends far beyond our family. You've dishonored every veteran who earned their medals through genuine sacrifice, and you've given ammunition to people who want to question the legitimacy of military service itself. Marcus's face crumpled as the full weight of his actions finally seemed to penetrate his understanding. He had been so focused on winning his personal battle against me that he had failed to consider the broader implications of his fraud. Now facing the consequences of his choices, he appeared to grasp for the first time how completely he had betrayed not just his family but his country. Judge Harrison nodded gravely and made notes on the documents before him.
Mr. Hayes, your statement is noted and will be included in the record. However, I want to be clear that your civil admission of wrongdoing does not affect the federal criminal charges you're facing. Those proceedings will continue in federal court regardless of what happens here today. The judge then turned his attention to the substantive matter at hand. Harold Pemberton presented the evidence that definitively established my right to inherit the lighthouse property, including Dad's original will, witness testimony about his mental competence when he signed it, and documentation of Marcus's fraudulent attempts to contest it. The case was straightforward now that the lies and forged documents had been exposed. But the most powerful moment came when Harold requested permission to present evidence about my actual military service record. The declassified documents were entered into evidence with the solemnity befitting their classification level and their significance to the case. As Harold read portions of my Medal of Honor citation aloud, describing actions that had saved dozens of lives under extreme combat conditions, I felt the atmosphere in the courtroom shift completely. The reporters who had come expecting a routine inheritance dispute suddenly realized they were witnessing something much more significant. Here was documented proof that I was not just a legitimate veteran but a genuine American hero whose service record was beyond reproach. The contrast with Marcus's fabricated allegations could not have been starker or more damaging to his credibility. When Harold finished reading the citation, Judge Harrison looked at me with unmistakable respect and said, "Sergeant Hayes, this court recognizes and honors your extraordinary service to our nation. The Medal of Honor is this country's highest military decoration, and it cannot be earned through deception or manipulation. Your service record speaks for itself and completely refutes every allegation made against you in this case." The formal ruling came swiftly after that. Judge Harrison declared that Dad's will was valid and legally binding, that my inheritance of the lighthouse property was uncontested and absolute, and that all of Marcus's claims were dismissed with prejudice. The civil case was over, decided not just by law but by the overwhelming weight of truth finally brought into the light, but the real drama was yet to come. As the judge prepared to adjourn the civil hearing, federal agents entered the courtroom and approached Marcus's table. The lead agent, a serious woman in a dark suit who moved with military precision, spoke quietly to Marcus's attorneys before addressing the court. "Your Honor, we have federal warrants for the arrest of Marcus Hayes on charges including conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and violations of the Espionage Act relating to unauthorized access to classified military information. We need to take Mr. Hayes into custody immediately." The courtroom erupted in chaos as reporters realized they were witnessing not just a civil judgment but a federal arrest. Camera operators scrambled for better angles while Marcus's attorneys huddled around their client, their faces grim with the knowledge that this moment had been inevitable since the scope of his crimes became clear. Marcus stood with what remained of his dignity intact, allowing the federal agents to place handcuffs on his wrists without resistance. As they led him toward the door, he paused and looked back at me one final time. There was no anger in his expression now, only a kind of hollow recognition of how completely he had destroyed his own life through choices that could never be undone. Mom rose to follow Marcus as he was led away, her composure finally cracking as the reality of his situation penetrated her shock and denial. She paused at my table, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since this nightmare began months earlier. For a moment I thought she might say something, might offer some acknowledgement of the pain her choices had caused. Instead, she simply nodded once, a gesture that might have been respect or farewell, or simply exhausted acceptance of consequences that could no longer be avoided. Then she followed the federal agents out of the courtroom, leaving behind the wreckage of relationships that had taken decades to build and only months to destroy. Tyler and I sat in the sudden quiet that followed the departure of the media circus and federal agents. The courtroom slowly emptied until only we, Harold Pemberton, and a few court officials remained. The lighthouse property was mine, legally and permanently, but the victory felt both complete and hollow. I had won everything I had fought for, but the cost in family relationships and personal pain was staggering. "It's over," Tyler said quietly, his voice carrying equal measures of relief and sadness. "This part is over," I corrected. "But Marcus will face trial, probably conviction, and definitely prison time. Mom will have to live with the knowledge that she chose to participate in destroying her daughter's reputation based on lies." The Hayes family name will be associated with scandal and criminality for years to come. In some ways, this is just the beginning. Harold Pemberton gathered his documents with the methodical care of a man who had seen too many families destroy themselves over money and property. Victoria, you should know that your father would be proud of how you handled this situation. You could have responded to Marcus's attacks with equal cruelty, but you chose to fight with truth and integrity instead. That's the mark of genuine character. As we left the courthouse, walking past the lingering media presence toward Tyler's car, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me from the deserts of the Middle East to a Maine courtroom, where I had to prove my own identity and worth to my own family. The lighthouse keeper's house was waiting for me, perched on its cliff overlooking Penobscot Bay, a symbol of endurance and guidance that had weathered every storm for over a century. The federal trial would come later, with its own drama and revelations. Marcus would face the full consequences of his choices, while Mom would have to decide whether to testify against him or face charges as a co-conspirator. The Hayes Maritime Holdings Company would probably be dissolved, its assets seized to pay restitution to the veterans Marcus had bribed and the government agencies he had defrauded. But all of that was in the future. For now, Tyler and I drove home through the Maine countryside, past fishing villages and rocky coastline that had shaped our family for generations, carrying with us the knowledge that truth had finally prevailed over deception, and justice had been served despite the best efforts of people who had forgotten what honor really meant. The lighthouse beam would continue its nightly sweep across the dark waters of Penobscot Bay, guiding vessels safely to harbor just as it had for over a century. And the Hayes family would endure, scarred but not broken, reduced in number but strengthened in character, ready to rebuild on a foundation of truth rather than the lies that had nearly destroyed us all. Some battles are worth fighting regardless of their cost, and some victories are measured not in what you gain, but in what you refuse to lose. My Medal of Honor was safe, my reputation was restored, and my inheritance was secure. But most importantly, I had proven to myself and to the world that integrity cannot be purchased, honor cannot be faked, and family bonds built on truth are stronger than any conspiracy built on lies. 6 months after Marcus's federal sentencing hearing, I stood on the widow's walk of the lighthouse keeper's house, watching the autumn sun paint Penobscot Bay in shades of gold and crimson. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the maple trees surrounding the property had transformed into torches of orange and red that seemed to burn against the darkening sky. In my hands, I held a letter from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, informing me that Marcus had been transferred to a minimum security facility, where he would serve the remaining 8 years of his sentence. 8 years. The number felt both enormous and somehow insufficient when measured against the magnitude of his crimes. The federal prosecutors had been thorough in their case, documenting not just the fraud and conspiracy charges, but the broader pattern of corruption that had infected Hayes Maritime Holdings for over a decade. Marcus had stolen from veterans, compromised national security, and attempted to destroy his sister's reputation, all in service of greed that had ultimately cost him everything he thought he was protecting. Tyler emerged from the house carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, his presence a welcome interruption to my brooding contemplation of justice and consequence. He had moved into the lighthouse keeper's house with me during the summer, not permanently, but for long enough to help me decide what role this place would play in the rest of my life. His art studio occupied what had once been Dad's workshop, and his canvases now captured the moody beauty of our Maine coastline, with a depth and emotional resonance that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling into the weathered Adirondack chair beside mine. It was a question he had asked periodically over the months since the trial, not because he doubted my choices, but because he understood that victory could sometimes feel more complicated than defeat. About Marcus? No, about the family we lost. Every day, I sipped the coffee, tasting the familiar comfort of our morning ritual. I keep thinking about Christmas mornings when we were kids, before everything got complicated by money and business and adult disappointments. Do you remember how Marcus used to insist on being the one to distribute all the presents? Tyler smiled, his expression soft with memory. He had this elaborate system for making sure everyone got their gifts in the right order, building up suspense for the biggest surprises. He was bossy even then, but there was something genuine about wanting everyone to be happy. That's what I can't reconcile. Somewhere along the way, the boy who wanted everyone to be happy became a man who was willing to destroy his sister to get what he wanted. I understand the progression intellectually, but emotionally it still feels impossible.
We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fishing boats return to harbor with their day's catch. The rhythm of their engines carried across the water like a heartbeat, steady and reassuring in its predictability. Some things endured despite human frailty and moral failure, and the sea that had shaped our family for generations would continue its eternal dance with the shore long after all of us were gone. Mom's situation remained unresolved and painful in ways that were different from Marcus's clear guilt and punishment. She had cooperated with federal investigators once her attorney convinced her that obstruction charges would only make her situation worse, but her testimony had been limited and carefully hedged to minimize her own culpability. The prosecutors had ultimately decided not to charge her with conspiracy, accepting her lawyer's argument that she had been manipulated by Marcus rather than being an equal partner in his schemes. But legal immunity couldn't repair the damage to our relationship or erase the knowledge that she had chosen to participate in trying to destroy my reputation. She had moved to Florida after the trial, selling her Portland house and cutting ties with Maine and the memories that haunted every familiar street and landmark. Her Christmas card last year had included no personal message, just her signature, and a return address that felt like a rebuke to anyone who might want to reconnect. "Have you thought about reaching out to her?" Tyler asked, apparently following the same train of thought that had occupied my mind. "I've written probably 20 letters that I never sent. The problem is, I don't know what I would say. I forgive you feels dishonest, because I'm not sure I do forgive her completely. I still love you feels dangerous, because love without trust is just another form of vulnerability." Tyler nodded thoughtfully, his artist sensitivity attuned to the nuances of emotion that couldn't be easily resolved through legal proceedings or moral clarity. "Maybe forgiveness isn't something you decide to do all at once. Maybe it's something you practice gradually, until it becomes real." The wisdom in his words reminded me why Tyler had always been the heart of our family, the one who understood that healing was a process rather than an event. His own journey through this crisis had been marked by a quiet courage that was easy to overlook but impossible to dismiss once you recognized it. He had risked everything to stand for truth when it would have been safer to remain neutral, and he had done so without expecting recognition or reward. His art had evolved during these months of family turmoil, his paintings taking on themes of moral complexity and the price of integrity that reflected his personal growth through adversity. A gallery in Portland was planning a show of his recent work for the spring, with the provocative title Blood and Water, A Family Reckoning. The paintings were beautiful and disturbing in equal measure, capturing both the love that had once bound our family together and the betrayal that had torn us apart. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately," I said, watching a pair of seagulls wheel and dive for fish near the harbor entrance. "Wondering what he would have made of all this, how he would have handled Marcus's transformation from ambitious businessman to federal criminal." "He would have been heartbroken," Tyler replied without hesitation. "But he would have stood by you, just like he did when you joined the military against Mom's wishes. Dad understood that character is tested in crisis, and he would have been proud of how you handled yourself." The lighthouse keeper's house had become not just my home but my sanctuary during the long months of legal proceedings and family dissolution. I had renovated Dad's old study, turning it into an office where I worked on a book about military service and the challenges of transitioning to civilian life. The writing was therapeutic, a way of processing my own experiences, while hopefully helping other veterans navigate similar challenges. The Congressional Medal of Honor, which had been locked away in a Virginia safe deposit box for years, now hung in a simple frame in the study, not as a display of ego but as a reminder of what service really meant. The citation still moved me when I read it, not because of the recognition it represented, but because of the lives it commemorated, the soldiers who had made it home because of decisions I had made in moments of extreme danger. That medal had become the cornerstone of my legal vindication, the piece of evidence that made Marcus's fraud impossible to sustain once it was revealed. But its real value had nothing to do with courtrooms or inheritance disputes. It represented a moment when training, instinct and moral courage had combined to preserve lives that would otherwise have been lost, and no amount of legal or family drama could diminish the significance of that achievement. The broader implications of Marcus's case had rippled through the veteran community in ways that continued to surprise me. His attempts to bribe and intimidate former soldiers into providing false testimony had exposed vulnerabilities in the system that protected military service records, leading to congressional hearings and new legislation designed to prevent similar abuses. Several of the veterans who had initially agreed to lie for money had become advocates for protecting the integrity of military honors, speaking publicly about the shame and regret they felt for their participation in the fraud. Colonel Stevens had been instrumental in these broader reforms, using his influence and connections to ensure that Marcus's case became a catalyst for positive change, rather than just another example of corruption and betrayal. He had visited me twice since the trial, bringing updates on legislative progress and sharing stories about other veterans who had been inspired by my willingness to fight for the truth despite enormous personal cost. The thing about integrity, he had said during his last visit, is that it's contagious. When people see someone willing to stand up for what's right, even when it hurts, it reminds them that they have the same choice. Your case has inspired a lot of people to examine their own compromises and decide they can do better. The financial aftermath of Marcus's crimes had been almost as complex as the legal proceedings. Hayes Maritime Holdings had been dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to victims and cover the costs of the federal investigation. The company that Dad had built from nothing, and Marcus had expanded it into a regional success story, was gone, erased by criminal choices that had poisoned every aspect of its operations. But from that destruction had come unexpected opportunities. Several former Hayes Maritime clients had approached me about starting a new shipping company, one that would be built on the principles of honesty and ethical business practices that Dad had originally embodied. I was considering the proposal, not because I needed the money, but because it might be a way to restore the Hayes name to something approaching respectability. What do you think Dad would say about the shipping company idea? I asked Tyler as we prepared to head inside for lunch. I think he would say that names are just words, but character is forever. If you decide to rebuild the family business, do it because you believe in the work, not because you feel obligated to repair what Marcus destroyed. The lighthouse itself had become a symbol of endurance and guidance that extended beyond our family's personal story. Local historians had approached me about opening it for tours, sharing the history of lighthouse keeping in Maine, and the role these towers had played in guiding ships safely to harbor for over a century. The idea appealed to me as a way of honoring Dad's memory, while contributing something positive to the community that had been embarrassed by Marcus's crimes. Community reaction to our family's scandal had been mixed and evolving. Some people had always been suspicious of the Hayes family's rapid rise from working-class origins to regional prominence, and Marcus's downfall confirmed their worst suspicions about money and corruption. Others had known Dad personally, and understood that his son's crimes didn't reflect the values he had tried to instill in his children. Most encouraging were the veterans who had reached out to offer support and share their own stories of family conflict and moral challenge. Military service created bonds that transcended normal social boundaries, and I had discovered a community of people who understood both the pride of serving with honor and the pain of having that honor questioned by people who should have known better. The local VFW post had asked me to speak at their Veterans Day ceremony, an invitation I had initially declined, out of reluctance to become a public figure defined by family tragedy. But Tyler had convinced me that sharing my story might help other veterans facing similar challenges, and I had ultimately agreed to participate. The speech had been well received, focusing on the importance of supporting veterans' families and the dangers of allowing greed to poison relationships built on love and shared sacrifice. Winter was approaching with the inevitable certainty that marked seasonal change in coastal Maine. The tourist boats had stopped running, the summer residents had closed their cottages and returned to cities farther south, and the landscape had taken on the austere beauty of a region preparing for months of cold and solitude. I loved this time of year, when the coastline belonged once again to the people who chose to live here permanently rather than those who visited for recreational escape. Tyler would return to his own apartment in Portland soon, though he had promised to spend Christmas with me in the lighthouse keeper's house. It would be our first holiday together without any other family members, a bittersweet milestone that marked both loss and liberation. We had talked about establishing new traditions that honored Dad's memory, while acknowledging that the family constellation he had presided over no longer existed. The book I was writing had become more than a therapeutic exercise. It was evolving into a comprehensive guide for veterans dealing with family conflict and public challenges to their service records. My editor believed it could help thousands of veterans who face similar situations on a smaller scale, people whose families didn't understand their military experience, or whose communities questioned their sacrifices. The writing process had forced me to examine not just Marcus's betrayal, but my own role in the family dynamics that had made such betrayal possible. I had been absent for long periods, focused on military service and personal healing in ways that had left room for resentment and misunderstanding to grow. While that didn't excuse Marcus's crimes, it helped me understand how relationships could deteriorate when communication failed and assumptions replaced honest conversation. Mom's exile in Florida remained painful and unresolved, a wound that might never fully heal. But I had begun to accept that some relationships couldn't be repaired simply through goodwill and forgiveness. She had made choices that revealed fundamental differences in values and character, and those differences might be too profound to bridge regardless of our shared history and genetic connection. The Congressional Medal of Honor had become something more than personal recognition during these months of crisis and recovery. It had become a symbol of the truth's ultimate power to overcome deception, regardless of how sophisticated or well-funded that deception might be. Marcus had spent enormous sums and years of planning to destroy my reputation, but he couldn't fake the kind of documented heroism that had earned me the nation's highest military decoration. Standing on the Widow's Walk as autumn deepened toward winter, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with legal victories or family vindication. I had fought for my honor and won, but more importantly, I had learned to define myself by my own actions rather than other people's opinions or expectations. The girl who had left Penobscot Bay 25 years earlier to find herself in military service had finally come home to discover that home wasn't a place or a family structure, but a state of internal peace built on integrity and self-acceptance. The lighthouse beam began its nightly sweep across the darkening bay, just as it had for over a century, guiding vessels safely through treacherous waters toward the safety of harbor. Some things endured despite human frailty and moral failure, and some truths were strong enough to survive any storm that greed or betrayal could unleash against them. Tyler was right about forgiveness being a practice rather than a decision. I was learning to forgive Marcus gradually, not because he deserved it, but because carrying hatred was exhausting and ultimately self-destructive. He would serve his sentence and live with the consequences of his choices for the rest of his life. I would continue building a life based on honor, integrity, and service to something larger than my own desires. The Hayes family name would survive, carried forward by Tyler's art and my writing, by our commitment to the values Dad had taught us, and our rejection of the corruption that had nearly destroyed us. Some legacies were worth preserving, and some fights were worth winning regardless of their cost. As darkness settled over Penobscot Bay and the lighthouse beam continued its faithful vigil, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you have stood for truth when it mattered most, and that sometimes, just sometimes, truth is strong enough to prevail against even the most determined opposition. The lighthouse keeper's daughter had finally come home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.